Welcome everyone. My name is Bill Moore-Kilgannon. I'm the Executive Director of Public Interest Alberta, former Executive Director of this august organization, Parkland Institute, and currently on the board of the Parkland Institute. So it's my pleasure to be hosting this session. We are very thrilled to have with us Munir Sheikh. He is the former Chief Statistician for Statistics Canada. I know our organization is very concerned about what's been happening at StatsCan. We're actually releasing a report on Tuesday with the College of Social Workers and the Edmonton Social Planning Council on child poverty, and there's huge concerns about what's happening with the collection of information at Stats Canada, and so we're very, very thrilled to have him here. I'm assuming most people have had a chance to read his full bio. There's just one correction. He's now here in Alberta. He is an executive fellow at the University of Calgary. And I asked him what that meant, and he says, I have no idea. But I do get to teach, and I do get to do research. And then I said, so if women are executive fellows at the University of Calgary? He says, yes, that's true. So there you go. You could be both a man and a woman and still be an executive fellow at the University of Calgary. Please welcome Munir Sheikh.
Well, let me first say that I am not going to be standing there. I'll be rather here so I can look at my slides and talk about them. If I stand there, I won't be able to see what I'm going to be saying, so that doesn't work. Thank you, Bill, for the introduction, and thanks to the Parkland Institute for inviting me here. Since leaving my job as the Chief Statistician, I have been talking about a couple of things, and I think it really is important for me to be sharing my thoughts on these things with you. Hopefully, you are like me and think that evidence is important for decision making, and I'm going to be sharing some examples of that here today. At one level, the use of evidence for decision making is really such a simple concept. Every one of us on a daily basis looks at some facts, some statistics, some data, some evidence to make our decisions. And at least for me, making my decisions based on this kind of information leads me to make better decisions than if I was making those decisions in the dark. We buy groceries, we go get gasoline, we buy cars, we buy houses, we get mortgages. Just imagine if you were doing all of that stuff without knowing what is available in the marketplace. And so decision making based on that information I think is more productive than without it. The consequence of that is that sometimes when we face trade-offs, like I can buy this, but if I buy this, I cannot buy that because I'm going to run out of money. Some of those trade-offs are facilitated if we had evidence. So for example, if I buy this, but I can get this at a cheaper price somewhere else, then of course that saves me money. So maybe with that saved money, I can do this as well. So those trade-offs are somewhat easier, and it basically allows us to do more with our limited resources. This is true as well for the business sector. Businesses make those decisions every single day as to how to cut cost and raise more revenue, and they look at all kinds of evidence to come to those decisions. When it actually gets to public policy, this simple point that evidence is good for you somehow becomes debatable, and it isn't quite clear to those who make public policy decisions that evidence is actually good for them. And so that's the part I'm going to be talking about today. In my presentation today, I am going to cover three topics. One is the topic of carbon taxes and or environmental taxes in general, So maybe I'm trying to be a bit more provocative coming here in the West and talk about carbon tax or environmental taxes. I'm also going to talk about the social assistance program that I was asked by the government of Ontario along with Francis Lankin to review. We submitted our report last year, and I think it's another good example of how evidence can help you develop better programs. And then, of course, my favorite topic, the long form census, and I'll touch upon that a bit as well. So let me start with the environmental taxes. Those of you who are students of economics would have known that the very first course you take in economics, we call it Economics 101. These Economics 101 courses teach us that when some of our actions create what we call externalities. What do we mean by that? Simply this: if I do something and it affects you, then the market doesn't work. Someone has to intervene in the marketplace to say, I must take into account the consequences of my actions for others, and so I need to be told what to do in those circumstances. I think the good example of that is secondhand smoke. If I smoke and it affects your health, I need to take that into account, and if I don't, then there is public policy which tells me how I can do that, and there are a variety of ways to take that into account. Taxation is one of them. I pay pretty high tobacco taxes, if I smoke. The same is true for pollution. I would inflict harm on others if I pollute, and the market wouldn't produce the right outcome, and so public policy has to come in and do something about it. So if public policy doesn't deal with this externality issue, economics tells us that our resources in the economy are going to be misallocated, our living standards are going to be worse than they could be, and so government has a role to play to fix this problem. And the outcome, of course, is if you take steps to deal with these issues, your living standards should be higher. There is immediately this question that arises: if externalities, pollution, are an economic problem and public policy would help to raise our living standards by fixing it, why do we talk about a trade-off? Why do people keep saying, if I deal with this issue, my economy is going to be worse off, and only then can I achieve a better environmental outcome? Why is there this trade-off? And that's what I'm going to deal with as part of the few words I'm going to say about this. The other conclusion that economic analysis tells us in light of this issue is that tax is the optimal policy lever to fix this problem. There are a variety of ways of dealing with it. Regulations is one, tradable permits is another, but economic theory tells us that tax is the best way to deal with this. And so the question arises whether there is any evidence to back this thing up, or is it just pure straight economic theory which doesn't have any relevance in the real world? And that is what I'm going to be showing you today, that there is indeed some evidence to show that if we were to have our tax policy right, we can do well both on the environment and the economic front. So I've just said a few words about the carbon tax, but the issue, as I said, is more general than that, and we can apply that to environmental taxes overall. There is a debate in this country on carbon taxes. We haven't made much progress on that front except for the BC. There is a wide range of conflicting views on the issue. Some say it will hurt the economy. Others say it may or may not hurt the economy, it will hurt me. Some feel there's an obligation on all of our parts to improve the environment and do something about it, and we should be willing to pay a cost for it. Others have argued, no, as I just said, there can be win-win outcomes, and we should take steps to make both the environment and the economy better. So what I've done here is collect evidence on a number of what I call high-performance countries. These are countries which have taken the environment fairly seriously, and taken environmental taxes fairly seriously. So I'm going to look at these 4 countries. I'm going to throw in there as well an average for the countries of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. There are about 40 of those. I'm going to put Canada and the US in that pack, and then just look at their performance. This is a chart on the burden of taxation in the area of the environment in relation to the economy. So these are all taxes on issues related to the environment as a proportion of GDP. And what you find here in this chart very quickly, that US and Canada tax the environment part of the economy least heavily, and countries like Denmark and Netherlands have pretty high taxes, followed by Sweden and Norway. The 40-country average for the OECD is above Canada and the US, but below the 4 countries that I have on the right-hand side of the chart. So this is the overall tax burden in relation to the size of the economy. We are a low tax country in that international comparison. However, it's quite possible that while some countries raise more of their taxes from the environment, that could mean either that overall tax burden is higher or that they rely less on other taxes. So to look at that, we see this chart, which shows that a lot of these countries actually have a different mix of taxation, and out of a total tax take, their taxes on the environment are higher compared to other taxes. So again, this chart corroborates what the previous chart said. Some countries rely pretty heavily on taxing pollution. What follows from that is this chart, which says in our production of a variety of things that we produce in the country, we use energy a lot more than some of the high tax countries. So Canada uses most energy per unit of production compared to anybody else. US is next, and these high tax countries, as you would expect, do not use energy to the same extent that we do in our production process. This is a chart which is similar to the previous one, but it focuses instead of production on consumption, and here we find that Canada uses material as part of its consumption more heavily than any other country. US is next. Again, what you would expect if prices have an effect, what this chart shows is how greenhouse gas emissions have performed since 1990 to 2012. And what you find here is that these high tax countries have seen a pretty significant reduction in their greenhouse gas emissions, at least 3 of them. Canada has seen a fairly large increase in our emissions over this period, followed by the US, which is a distant second compared to us. So we haven't done well on these emissions. That was the environment part. High taxes on polluting activities, and as a result, less of a pollution. Now I go to the economic part. This is a chart on productivity growth, the most important variable one can look at to determine whether or not we're doing well on the income front. Our living standards simply will not rise over time if our productivity does not increase over time. Paul Krugman, who won a Nobel Prize in economics some years ago, has a famous quote which says, productivity growth is not everything, but it is just about everything. So it's just right up there that without productivity growth, we simply cannot imagine that our living standards would rise. We are the second last in this chart. The US is way ahead of us in this area. And this is the level of per capita income. So if we take total output in the economy divided by the number of people, what does it show? We find that Canada is in the middle of the pack. That was some indicators on the economic stuff. This is a chart which is trying to capture a social indicator. It's called the Gini coefficient. There's no need for us to be technical about it. All it means is that the higher the Gini number, the more unequal is the income distribution. And the lower the number, the better off you are, in income distribution. So the US is the worst based on this indicator. We are the second worst. And countries which I just showed you have pretty high environmental taxes. They do quite well on the social front. So I've shown you three sets of indicators: environmental, economic, and social. It seems like we are not doing quite well in this international comparison, but it is quite a lot of indicators. And so the challenge is there any way for us to combine all of this information and produce one indicator which summarizes the whole thing? And so this is the indicator that I have come up with. It combines those three sets of indicators I just showed you, and what I find here is that Canada actually is at the bottom of this comparison, which takes, as I said, high performance countries, the OECD average, so it's just an average of all the 40 odd rich countries, and then of course our trading partner next door, the US and us. And that comparison would show you, I hope it does show us, that countries that have pretty high environmental taxes are actually doing quite well compared to those like Canada and the US which do not. After looking at these indicators, I would suggest that we cannot draw a strong conclusion, which these charts seem to show, which is that environmental taxes actually improve environmental, economic, and social outcomes. The reason we cannot do that is all I've shown you is association. I haven't showed you causation. So I can make the argument that taxes are good for you. But at the same time, I would argue that you cannot reject a weaker conclusion, which is that if you had high environmental taxes, it does not automatically mean that your economic, social, and environmental performance would be bad. I think we have seen enough evidence which says, if you go down this path and you follow appropriate policies, there's no reason why you cannot come out ahead. So my conclusion from this set of indicators is that we need to get serious about what I call an economic problem. Economic problem of pollution and public policy not being used or not being used appropriately to deal with this problem. We need to get serious about it, and we need to get serious in a manner that we use public policy properly. So as a result, we can take steps to improve both our environmental and our economic performance. And in the process, I would argue there's no reason for us to be worried about inappropriate social consequences from this policy. So that's my first topic. My second topic, again to drive home the point that evidence is important for public policy decision making, I'm going to show you, some information from the report that Francis Lankin and I submitted to the Government of Ontario last year, where we suggested to the government that they should thoroughly reform the social assistance, or what others would call a welfare program. This structure of Ontario's social assistance program isn't very different from the programs which you would see across the country or across the Western world. So what I'm going to say about Ontario, in my view, applies to just about every province in Canada and a lot of other countries. So if someone doesn't have a job and has exhausted all sources of earning and income, that person would get to the social assistance or welfare program. What should this program be trying to achieve? I would say very simply two things. The first is provide this individual who has exhausted all other sources of income some reasonable level of income support during the time that person cannot work. So that's the first thing. The second thing that this program needs to achieve is to help these people out in finding work. And for that, you need effective employment services. These two fairly simple objectives require that we have evidence and we have systems to deliver that program. What kind of evidence do we need? Well, the first thing you would want to know is who actually needs our help. And for that, you need to have simple rules on income and asset limits. How much do you earn? How rich you are? And that kind of information is quite critical in determining who should get our help. The second question that arises is, so how much help should you get? And there are three objectives which we should try to achieve in answering that question. First, help should be such that it actually is enough to satisfy somebody's basic needs, adequacy. It should have appropriate incentives. What do we mean by that? What it means is that if you go and earn some income as you are getting welfare, then that income that you earn obviously would reduce your benefit levels, but that reduction in benefits should not create disincentives for you to go seek work. A third objective is the objective of fairness, which simply means that if I am on welfare and someone else is working full time, I may have some market income as well being on welfare. That fairness demands that people who are on welfare should not be financially better off than people who are working full time. If that is the case, in addition to being unfair, it would create wrong incentives for people to work. The third issue where we need evidence is, so what kind of help should people get? As an example, there's a need to provide individualized employment services consistent with the needs that people have, and as well provide support to these people to get up to the level that employers would find that you are job ready. So we need evidence on all of that. And what systems do we need to deliver this help? I would suggest that we need some technology that would pull together the needs of the clients for the kind of people they're looking for work. That the technology would match the employer's needs with the skills of the recipients. And if there are gaps between the two, what do employers need and what do recipients of welfare offer in terms of skill levels? If there's a gap between the two, we need training programs that can fill that gap. So that is the description of a fairly simple system. Two objectives, need for some evidence, and the need for systems that would deliver these programs. So in contrast with what is it that we need, what is it that the Ontario program actually delivers? It's a program which is truly rich on rules. There are two parts to the program. The first is the very basic welfare program, that provides support to people who don't have any other source of income. The second part is for people with disabilities. When I took on this task of evaluating Ontario's program, I did not have a clue that that 60% of the $8 billion budget that this program has is actually for people with disabilities. They are more in numbers, the benefit levels are higher, so the budget for this program is disproportionately larger for people with disabilities than the regular program. There are hundreds and hundreds of rules in this program with inconsistent treatment of just about everything you can think of. We were told by caseworkers that they spend 70% of their time trying to figure out, understand, and interpret the rules that they're given. And in fact, we heard stories from some caseworkers who were quite honest and said, every time we get a new directive from Toronto on how to implement this program, we just pick that thing up and throw it into the garbage bin because we do not have the time to read that goddamn stuff. They just won't read it. They were so angry that they are basically wasting their lives just trying to read these rules rather than go out and actually help the people who actually need their help. There are more than 30 special benefits in that program. Now just imagine this. that if you are on welfare and you get these special benefits, and there are more than 30 of them, and you lose each one of those benefits when you go to work, depending on how valuable these benefits are, would you actually want to go to work if you were to lose those benefits? And the examples of the benefits, you have health coverage, you have drugs, you have dental, you have vision, you have disability support, you have a special diet allowance which is worth about $500 a quarter. With all of those benefits, it is pretty hard for someone to actually make a decision to go to work when you're going to lose all of that stuff. There's a famous story of this person who began to be called $0 Linda Chamberlain, who actually made a decision, said, I am actually going to go and work rather than be on welfare. So she went to work and found that her real income actually fell after she went to work. So she took it for a few months and then said, I can't afford it anymore, so I am going to go back to welfare. So that's the kind of incentive that this program creates. In this program, there are about 240 different benefit rates. So the caseworker has to try to figure out which of those 240 benefit rates do you qualify for. Just imagine the amount of time it would take that person to do that. Now in Canada, we have a national child benefit system. Every child, both from the federal government and provincial governments, gets a benefit. This is a universal benefit for every child. On top of that, this social assistance program provides further benefits to children, to those who are on welfare. And there are 50 different benefit rates for these children, on top of, as I said, the national child benefit system. All of this to say, this rules-based program is complex, and everybody's focus is how do we follow these rules rather than do anything about getting help for these people. And so this program fails all the three tests that I've described to you before: the test of adequacy, of incentives, and of fairness. We have no proper evidence to judge whether or not we can achieve any of these objectives, and we don't have the appropriate systems that I mentioned to you before that we need for a program to be well functioning. So how do we go from a system which is truly complex to a system which is really simple? In our report to the government, we offered a blueprint. We said that there should be one simple program, not two. Should be delivered by municipalities and First Nations. A very simple benefit structure with simple income and asset limits tests. We recommended that employment services and supports be strengthened considerably. We need better systems, the systems I described to you, and we need evidence on adequacy, fairness, and incentives. And of course, we need stronger accountability, so if something doesn't work, people know where to go and find answers to the questions that they have. It's unfortunate that when you try to go to a simple system and you start with a really complex system, the change itself is going to be pretty complex. And that change, which is going to be pretty hard, creates two kinds of challenges. One is a political challenge, where a government has to demonstrate leadership for transformative change. And the second challenge, of course, is that any time you change policy in such a dramatic manner as we are suggesting, is going to create winners and losers. On the political challenge, there's of course no recommendation that we can make. It really is in the hands of the government as to whether or not they would take on this challenge. On winners and losers, in our report we have recommended an appropriate pace of change that everybody can actually handle, and grandfathering for people who could be adversely affected by what we are recommending. I'm going to show you this chart which goes beyond social assistance programs. It's called the marginal effective tax rates. It comes from a publication from the C.D. Howe Institute in Toronto. And the simple way of looking at this chart is to ask yourself the question, if I earned another $100 by working, what portion of that $100 can I actually keep? And there are two sources for your loss. One is as you earn more income, you have to pay a tax on that income. The second part of the loss is that, again, as you earn more income, some benefits that you're getting from the government, those benefits may actually diminish. So when you add these two, I pay more tax and I get less benefits. That would tell me what part of that extra income that I earn I can actually keep in my pocket. And this chart tells you what that number is. You can see two things from that chart. One, there is no pattern through this line. It is totally random. And of course it is totally random because there are so many government programs which provide benefits to people, and they have different thresholds at which those benefits begin to come down as you earn more income. Complete non-coordination between government departments, both within a province and the federal government. So that's one, randomness of this, and nobody should be quite sure where you are on this chart. The second thing you'll see is for some income ranges, this number is quite big. Like in the $30,000 to $40,000 income range, if someone actually went and earned extra income, they could lose about 70% of that income to the government. And so the incentive for these people to go and do extra work or earn higher income is quite diminished. The example I gave you of $0 Linda is an extreme example within this chart which says Linda actually faced a tax rate from this chart which is over 100%. And so these are averages, and of course there are people whose tax rates would be over 100%. And so of course that creates economic effects which simply are that these people, even if they're offered extra income in the marketplace, would actually not be willing to go and earn that income, and so it has worse consequences. So that's my second topic for today. My third is the National Household Survey. The information from Statistics Canada based on the results of the survey was put out over the past year, and the last set of data on income and housing was released recently. The response rate for the National Household Survey, actually 68.6%. There is this thing called the global non-response rate. So a non-response rate is, basically, so what percentage of the population responded to the survey? 68.6. The global non-response rate adds that number with the number on the response rate for answering certain questions. So it's the item response rate plus the population response rate. You add them together, and that's your response rate, and 100 minus that response rate is the global non-response. So 26.1% is the non-response rate for the National Household Survey. The census cutoff is 25%. What does that mean? What it means is that if some area of the country responded in a manner that both for the population response and the item response, the non-response was 25%, Statistics Canada would not publish those data. In the NHS, that number is 26.1%. So if we assume that on average the non-response from the country is 26.1%, what that means is that Statistics Canada would not have published any data from the National Household Survey because the quality would not be good enough. And so to publish the data from the National Household Survey, Statistics Canada had to reduce the quality threshold for disseminating this information. So while the census cutoff rate is 25%, the cutoff rate for data from the NHS is 50%. So if the non-response rate is 49%, you still get the data from StatCan. So even by lowering the quality threshold for disseminating this information, which is double the 25% rate, data were released by Statistics Canada for only 75% of the 4,567 census subdivisions in Canada. For Saskatchewan, data have been released for only 57% of the census subdivisions. Furthermore, in publishing this information, in contrast to the past, where StatCan would link information they released as part of the census to previous censuses, so you could see change over time, they haven't done that this time because the NHS data, although it's on the same variables as the census data, you cannot compare that with the past because of totally different methodologies. So these time series comparison, for example, have poverty rates gone down or gone up? You can't do the comparison because the data have been collected on totally different bases. So that's the quality part of it. And I find that this information that the quality threshold was raised from 25% to 50% is pretty serious stuff. And it's only because of the drop in quality standards that we have any data from the NHS. So that's the quality part of it. What about the cost of data collection? The cost of the NHS turned out to be $652 million, which is, by the way, $22 million more than if the government had actually let the census to proceed. So having a voluntary survey cost a lot more money than a census would. So it wasn't an effort to save money that led the government to make that decision. It was something else. And the reason why it would cost more money, fairly simple. The sample size was increased. There was a need to follow people up. In the case of a census, you tell someone you are going to be breaking the law if you do not complete the census form. In the case of the NHS, they could refuse to complete the census form, and you have to go after them, pleading and begging for them to complete the form. That, of course, is going to cost money. As well, when the responses come in, there are more problems with this information, and so you have to spend resources to try to fix this much more than the census information would. So more costly, less data quality. So what is the reaction of data users to the information that has been put out? I'm going to summarize an article from the Globe and Mail which appeared a couple of weeks ago, where people were asked what their view was of the NHS data quality. And these quotation mark responses from that article: these data are garbage, they are dangerous for use, they're totally useless. That's the response from people who are supposed to be using this data. So higher cost and lower quality. What is the rationale for this? And the government's response is for privacy reasons. Now, all of the other StatCan surveys, are being completed by respondents. A lot of them are mandatory. So why single out this one source of information compared to everything else for it to become voluntary? And the question then arises, does this trade-off between privacy and data quality make any sense? I don't know what your answer to the question is. I would, give a pretty strong no. It doesn't make much sense. If it was left to me, of course I would, do a long-form census, but the choice between spending $652 million for a voluntary survey versus not doing anything at all, I would have said, just forget about this, let's not do anything, let's just save that money, because these data aren't really very useful. So as much as we talk about the importance of data quality and worry about the fact that the NHS data may not be usable to any significant extent, in my mind, there are two bigger issues than the issue of data quality. The first is the issue of the census as an anchor. And the second is the issue of trust in Statistics Canada's independence, a doubt that has been sown in the minds of Canadian data users based on the action that the government took in cancelling the long form. So what is the role of an anchor? I think of the census as a doctor living in a community. So just like in a community, you have sick people and you have a doctor. Sick people have a problem, you take them to a doctor, the doctor tells you what's wrong with them, and then of course you use the medication that the doctor gives you. Similarly, in a community of surveys that Statistics Canada conducts, the census is the doctor. You look at other surveys and you say, so what's wrong with this survey? And then look at the census and say, I can figure out what's wrong with the survey. I'm going to use the census information to fix the survey problem. And now we've taken the doctor out of the picture. So it's like saying to patients, if you have a problem, go talk to another patient to figure out what could be wrong with you and let that patient give you the advice. That is exactly what StatCan has done to fix the NHS. Look at other surveys and old advice from the census of 2006. And so whatever you see in the NHS, if somebody asks me, so what do you think about the quality of this data? My answer is, I actually do not know. I have no way of knowing what the truth is and how do I compare this information I have with something I actually have no information about. And so the impact of losing the long form census is going to be felt more and more over time for other surveys because we have nothing to compare those surveys with to fix any problems that they may have. And the issue of trust. Now, I am the former chief statistician. If somebody showed me some data and asked me, do you think these data are good or bad? I won't have any way of knowing whether or not these data are good or bad because the collection and production of data is truly a complex exercise. And so whether I use this information or not really depends on whether I trust the organization which is producing that information. And if something happens to reduce my trust in that organization, I get worried about the data. And that means that even if the data being produced are good, if I am not sure I can trust that organization, then my faith in even those good data begins to diminish. And that has been happening since the cancellation of the long form census. There was an article Todd Hirsch wrote in the Globe and Mail where he describes going to a conference, making a presentation, and somebody in the audience said, how can you trust Statistics Canada's numbers on inflation? And the response Todd Hirsch gave was, well, because I trust in Statistics Canada. They are one of the best organizations in the world in collecting data. To which the response was, how can you say that after what the government did to it in the cancellation of the long form census? And so, the conclusion that one draws from this kind of story is, if people are not quite sure they can trust the organization, you start losing trust in the data. So it's not just a story Todd Hirsch told, which worries me. I have experienced that firsthand myself. I've spoken to a lot of people about a variety of statistical issues, and they all keep coming back with the same thing. How can you trust StatCan after what happened with the long form census? In fact, I should know better than anybody else what kind of pressure the government puts on the statistical agency. So that is the thing which worries me the most. What do we do with this? I have been arguing over the past little while that Statistics Canada should become like the Canada Revenue Agency. The Statistics Act, which governs Statistics Canada, is flawed. It gives a lot of powers for fairly technical issues to the minister responsible for StatCan rather than to the chief statistician. And my view is that given the flawed nature of that law and the fact that we have within the Government of Canada an organization where the government actually cannot interfere we should take that model and apply it to StatCan as well. So it will be the chief statistician who has the authority to decide on a number of technical issues rather than the minister. And so issues such as what questions are going to be asked in the census, these are issues that the chief statistician would decide. And the question of whether or not a voluntary survey is as good as a mandatory census, that's a question the chief statistician would decide, not the minister, as the minister did 3 years ago when he cancelled the long form census. And by the way, what I'm suggesting here is not much different from what some other countries have. Australia is a good example. It is the Australian chief statistician who decides what questions are going to be asked in the census. Not the minister, not the prime minister, not cabinet. And that is what I'm suggesting should be done in Canada as well. In my mind, the collection of data in general and the collection of data as part of a census in particular are so critical to an analysis of public policy issues and the determination of actual public policies that it cannot and should not be left in the hands of a politician. That's my talk. Thank you, and I'll be quite pleased to answer questions.
Thank you so much for that. Very interesting conversation, all sorts of stuff to digest there. So as we've seen in past sessions, we have about 20 minutes or so for questions and discussions going forward. And what we'd like to do is have our mic runners go around. I'm going to identify folks. I really want to focus also on gender balance if we could, and I really want to encourage those who have yet to ask questions or comments to put their hands up and go forward, particularly like to get some more youth, if I could, asking. So encourage that if we could. So we're going to start right here, and then where's my other mic runner here? Excellent.
It might just be me.
Okay. David?
Yeah, first one comment is that carbon tax is not a tax, it's a charge for an environmental service. The second, that's a comment. The second is a question. Recently, in the justification of the CETA, there was a figure bruited about how many $1 billion that was going to benefit the Canadian economy, and then some rough econometrics was done to say how many jobs that would be created by adopting the CETA. What is a low estimate, or do you have a low estimate of the cost to the Canadian economy annually of not having the data from the long-form census? And then how many jobs by the same sort of analysis have been lost as a result of this form of economic mismanagement by the federal government?
Actually, I don't have information on that, but one may not have the quantitative information on that, but just in terms of the qualitative effect, as I was saying in my talk, there are really very large consequences of that.
Well, we're talking tens of billions of dollars or just billions?
I won't have any number.
Okay, way at the very back of the room there.
Okay, so I know that. So, is one of the major concerns of losing the long-form census is that all the future data will eventually become more and more useless? Is there ever a possibility of ever getting the data back, or how are we going to be able to recover or fix the problem of the corrupted data?
There is no way of trying to fix the problems with the data we have got. That is the difficulty with the whole issue, and it is, as I was trying to argue, that when you do not know what is the reality out there, in the absence of that anchor, in the absence of that information, it really is not possible to try to figure out what problems exist and how they can be dealt with. And the best one can do is compare the old with the new and look at whether or not there are deviations in this which one can explain or not explain. And there are a variety of other sources of information one can look at to determine the extent to which you can handle these issues. Some would work, others will not. And I mean, what one really requires is a fairly detailed kind of an analysis of this to come to a view on the kind of question you're asking.
Thank you. So we've had, we're going to go with one more gentleman, and then we're going to go to 3 women, because we've had three men already, if we could.
Hi, thanks for your talk. If the privacy argument is bunk, why do you think that the government got rid of the long-form census?
Well, let me say that the privacy argument is problematic for me for a number of reasons. I guess the first would be that before Statistics Canada goes to ask any questions of anybody, we go to the Privacy Commissioner. I mean, I went and met the Privacy Commissioner myself to check whether or not there were any privacy issues related to what Statistics Canada was proposing to do, and the answer was no. It is also the case that in the past, the Privacy Commissioner has commented on a number of questions that StatCan asked, and every time the Privacy Commissioner made suggestions for changes to the questionnaires, those suggestions were always accepted. So there isn't a single situation that I'm aware of where Privacy Commissioner's concerns were not taken into account to their satisfaction. As well, if my memory serves me right, in the context of the 2006 census, and keep in mind there are 35 million Canadians now, there were 2 individuals who complained to Statistics Canada about privacy issues. There is this ongoing issue of some people not feeling comfortable answering the questions in a census because the US from Lockheed Martin was given a contract by StatCan to do some software work. I mean, Lockheed Martin does a lot of stuff for lots of people, and God knows, they probably have lots of other problems. But one problem which does not exist is Lockheed Martin having access to any of StatCan's data. They just don't. They never even come close to looking at StatCan's data. So providing software for census, is that a problem? I would say no, because if they are bidding for this and their bid comes out to be the best of all, then we should make a decision based on the cost pyramid analysis. So just looking at the evidence, it doesn't seem like it's the privacy issue. It doesn't seem to me it's the privacy issue. So there's something else going on. What else is going on? To the best of my ability to get an answer to that question, when I was still in my job, I could not. And so I don't have any factual information. Lots of people have speculated lots of things, but I'm not going to get into speculation here.
Hi, my name is Sadie Macklin. As someone who has personally experienced that trade-off between work versus social assistance, I understand completely the what is lost if I was to go back into the paid workforce. But I'm also trying to understand here, having attended the breakout session on privacy, comparing that with some of the information you're saying. How do we correlate using the technology efficiently to gather information and then still address those issues that were so high in the minds of Adam Molnar and Jason Foster in what gets correlated and combined there. I just find it so confusing, and with the people around me too, that I'm trying to encourage to get onto programs that are there and for example, some of the national programs like the disability tax credit that enables you to be part of the, to open a retired disability savings plan. But you have to have a tax credit that you're never going to make use of because you don't earn enough to make use of it.
Thank you for your comment.
Do you want to respond to that at all? Or?
No, I mean, what you're saying is quite reasonable. I mean, to get in the benefit of all of these credits, I mean, you need information, and you know, we do have a challenge on our hands.
Rich.
Just to pick up on the conversation as to the motivation why the federal government would discontinue the long survey, and of course you're not sure why, and many of us aren't sure why, but given the trend of this government to manipulate and hide what's going on, it seems to me that the motivation behind this long survey could be that there were things coming out in the long survey that they didn't like and that they didn't want to deal with.
Thank you for that comment. You know, there are lots of people who are cheering you up on that.
Pat, he's passing it over. We're just trying to get gender balance and stuff here.
So no.
Hello. If the NDP formed the next federal government and they reversed it and went back to the compulsory long-term census form, we'd have missed this segment of data, but would it be correctable?
Correctable if it means that, you know, we have 2006 and 2016, and we have this thing in the middle that is somewhat flawed, and if correctable means can we bring it up to the level of the other two, my answer is we just don't know. Like, there's just no way of knowing how good or bad this information is, because what is there out in reality, there's no way of knowing that, and we'll never know. There is you know, a list of things one can do statistically and econometrically to try to estimate the challenge that exists in this data. So if we had 2016 and 2006, you know, given those two endpoints, one can try to figure out what the problem is, and I think it would be helpful to improve the quality of data, but totally fix the problem, no.
Full census in we're going to go back to the mic here.
In 2016.
Just speaking about the level of social assistance, I think it makes sense that there has to be a financial incentive to work. But I hope, especially given the relatively high Gini coefficient we have in Canada, instead of us joining the race to the bottom, how about we increase minimum wage, and how about we look at benefits for everybody? I think it's just really important we mustn't allow low-end employers to dictate what we believe to be an acceptable living wage.
Thank you. We've got one young woman at the back, and then we're going to go over here. We'll go back to the men now for a little bit. There's one young woman at the back here, and then we'll...
Hi, thanks for your second point on public policy informing social assistance programs. I'm a social worker in the healthcare system, and I often find that the policies that inform program changes don't make any sense when they're practically applied, and especially like Alberta's coming up to potentially making a shift to a pharmacare model in Alberta. and some of the information that I've read, like in the newspaper, doesn't make sense about how it's going to help more low-income families, but actually it's going to, you know, the way that they're going to be setting up the means threshold for what your deductible will be very messy, and there's not really a lot of information. So I really hope that there will be more transparency with how the program will be structured and developed based on evidence. But if there, I don't know what type of evidence Alberta uses in kind of informing those type of policy changes. But my question to you is, as a statistician, I feel like as a young person, like, you live in a world where you're constantly a data source for I don't know how many corporations. We're always being tracked. There's always cookies on every website you go to, every app you use. My data is being collected. I don't know for what. Not that interesting. And I'm just wondering, like, you know, if we're entering a phase where the government, you know, has less information about me, but corporations have more information about me, how will that shift? And, like, will government start to look to corporations for information about its own citizens? Like, I don't know, like, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, as you said yourself, you know, transparency is really quite important. If you have information on, you know, various elements of the program, who is getting what, you have proper objectives, you have evidence, you know, related to those objectives, what your, you know, budget is, and how is that money going to get spent, what the outcomes of the effects of all of these are. I mean, all of that information is really quite important in trying to get a better handle on how this program is actually going to function.
Okay, we now have two mic runners, so we've got one over here, and then we'll go here.
Thank you for your presentation. And my understanding, I should also just say quickly, my understanding is that you resigned out of protest out of the cancellation of long-form census. And if that's correct, thank you also for that. Two questions. One is, in your examination of the carbon tax, did you also look at any non-market mechanisms and the efficacy of those? For instance, industrial sector strategies or a change in ownership patterns? And the second question is, it seems to me like the easiest way to eliminate the complexity and the bureaucracy in social assistance programs would be something like a guaranteed basic income. Did you also happen to look at that in your studies?
You know, there are quite a few pollutants out there, and the question which is really critical in coming to a view as to whether or not a tax is the right way to go or other instruments can be used to achieve the objectives. The question is whether or not you can live with the consequences of a pollutant if it doesn't get controlled to the same extent that you want. You know, as an example, greenhouse gas emissions. If you make a small error in estimating how much reduction in those emissions you can live with, is that so detrimental to your health and other outcomes that the cost is just too high. If you can live with some uncertainty, then tax is the best instrument, you know, to use. If you cannot, like for example, there are toxic substances. If you make a mistake about controlling them, then the consequences of that are so large that you don't want to take that risk. And so in those circumstances, other instruments such as regulation or tradable permits, something like that would probably be most helpful. So, you know, that's the criteria which you use to determine which of these instruments, you know, one would need. I think your second question is about the complexity of the social assistance program and how can one deal with it, right?
Whether you looked at guaranteed basic income.
Yeah, guaranteed annual income. There is a misperception out there that a guaranteed annual income is a new program which is going to cost so much money that we cannot afford it. And that seems to be the mindset. The reality is that in every one of these programs that we have, like the Government of Ontario, for example, has 45 different social programs. Every one of these programs is actually providing a guaranteed annual income to some group of population. So in a sense, we have 45 different guaranteed annual incomes depending on what group you belong to. And my understanding of the guaranteed annual income issue is, why don't you take all of these programs, simplify them, bring them under one structure, have, bureaucratic and administrative structures which are less costly, and so achieve these objectives. You have small programs dealing with small populations in a much bigger way, that it becomes more efficient. So if that is the way you proceed, then the cost of these programs, or the cost of guaranteed annual income, actually would go down compared to what we are spending now, and you'll achieve better outcomes. Of course, there's always the option of enriching this program, but that's a separate issue, which it doesn't mean that if you go down that path, you always have to enrich it. You can operate with the level of resources you have right now.
Thank you. We're going to go to this side of the room now.
Hi there. Hi. Okay, so you brought up the example of the individual in Ontario on the assistance program who determined that it was better to be on the assistance program than go back to work, and you mentioned that we should always have incentives to work rather than be on some sort of social assistance. And that brings up an increasingly well-known example in United States where people are working 40, 60, 80 hours a week and are still receiving some sort of social assistance like food stamps or other things. So my question for you is, well, I have a concern just generally with us subsidizing companies' profits at the expense of this. So I'm wondering, is there a role that the government has in tax policy in rather than us subsidizing company profits and they're not paying appropriate benefits or health care, disability, or that, can we implement some sort of tax policy that will incentivize them to provide these programs through themselves rather than us providing them through our own government mechanisms?
So you've gone into an area which is way beyond my expertise, okay? The question is, what is the appropriate level of responsibility for the business sector? I can have personal views on it, but that's not related to the topic that I'm really talking about, the use of evidence in decision making. It's a question of what is the right objective. And since it's really my opinion compared to somebody else's, I would rather not get into this. But let me make one comment which would fit into the kind of analysis I have presented here, and that is the question of whether or not some of the support that the business sector receives is appropriate. So that's one. The second is the question of whether or not there are social policy objectives that the country has which may be better achieved by asking the business sector to deliver that. So if I narrow down your question to those two issues, on the first, I'll give you the example where, in my mind, the policies supporting the business sector, they're not really appropriate. And that is in the context of the carbon tax. If you are going to put a tax on those who pollute, then that objective is inconsistent with the government actually providing support to those business sectors which pollute. And so we need to, if we want to go down this path, we need to remove that inconsistency. So the question is whether or not the tax treatment of the oil and gas sector is appropriate if the objective is to impose a tax on carbon. And lots of people have said that the support and subsidies that are being provided to this sector are inconsistent with the objective of dealing with these externalities. So we need to deal with that inconsistency. The second issue of whether or not the business sector can be given responsibilities for dealing with a lot of the social objectives that the country has. I would say that really is a case-by-case kind of a thing. You take, for example, our universal healthcare system, and the business sector, benefits from a universal healthcare system. Some businesses, in fact, pay for the premiums for their employees for healthcare. So that's one way of dealing with this. I have, in that context, made the argument that our healthcare system is incomplete, that there's a need for universal benefits for drug, dental, and vision. If we argue that the universal coverage of doctors and universal coverage for doctors and hospitals is desirable, we have that in Canada, and we argue that because of that, our costs are much lower and our coverage much broader than in the US. If that is the argument we make, why are we not making exactly the same argument for the other part of the healthcare system, which is drug, dental, and vision? I find it really strange that the same person can speak from the two sides of his mouth and say totally contradictory things. One time, our universal healthcare system is great because our costs are lower, but then our costs are going to actually go up, and we can't afford it if we have drug, dental, and vision coverage. Make up your mind which argument you're making, okay? But please be consistent. I have emphasized, and our report talks about it, that this issue of universal coverage for drug, dental, and vision should at least be studied, because my hunch is that if you go down that path, there's no reason why you cannot make it universal without increasing your cost. And so here is an area where you can actually give more responsibility to the business sector.
Excellent. So we have about 3 minutes left. 2 people with mics. We'll go one right after the other, so you can both have your comments and questions, and then we'll wrap up very quickly in the next 3 minutes that we have. So.
Right. Well, thank you so much, first of all, for being so.
Right into the mic, please.
Thank you so much for being so steadfast in your protection of the public interest over other special interests. I was president of the Canadian Society for Epidemiology and Biostatistics at the time that you were making your points so very eloquently. And we were one of some 700 organizations that wrote in support of your position. And as I understand it, there were 7 organizations that wrote to the government that were in support of the government's position, or the 2 people in the government that were so determined to eliminate the long-form census. It seems to me that, first of all, you should be awarded a congratulatory integrity, a professional integrity award for the position that you've taken, to walk away from a position where you were being forced to do things that were contrary to your professional values. So I commend you for having done that. And as an epidemiologist, I would dare to speculate that the reason for the government making that decision is so that it could indeed justify its own will to channel funds into those sectors of the community where they could see people being elected to support their office, as simple as that, and to hell with the public interest.
Great, thank you very much. Carol, quickly.
Yeah, thank you very much, and I strongly support everything you've done and stood for, and may you get a reward one day. But I want to say that the recent Parkland report on elder care shows very clearly the importance of that information that we had been getting and why we're not going to get it anymore. At the same time, I'm aware that we have just paid for an industry survey in home care, which collects even more information. So they're getting it, we're not, which connects with a lot of the sessions we had this morning, and it's so unfair.
Any last comments?
No, that's
excellent. Okay. Well, I appreciate that there were many people who wanted to ask questions. We'll hopefully have some time one-on-one. I hope everyone joins me in thanking Munir for joining.
Oh, thank you.
I think this is the award that you were talking about here. So thank you so much. The next session starts in 13 minutes, so they're back up where the other workshops were this morning. So we're going to get those started right on time. Thank you so much.